Malaika Ramsey. Thanks for joining us again this week. Of course, with me is leader of the People's National Congress Reform and leader of the opposition, Brigadier the Honourable David Granger. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you, Malaika.
Mr. Granger, on the 1st of August, joined the rest of Guyana to celebrate emancipation. Of course, we recognize it as one day. It's one national holiday, but some of us like to think of August as Emancipation Month. So we continue our discussion, which began last week when we focused on emancipation, what it really means to be free. This week we focus on emancipation regarding education. And my first question to Mr. Granger this week is, are we really free in the sense of education? How educated are our people?
Well, it's good that you should mention the meaning of emancipation, whether we're really free, because on the 3rd of August, Saturday the 3rd of August, this is the very question that a man called Damon asked in 1834. After the Emancipation Act was passed, he was at a plantation at La Belle Alliance on the Essequibo coast, and he was told that, well, all of the Africans were told that the Emancipation Act had been passed, but they had now become apprentices and they had to continue working on the same plantation for 6 more years. And of course he rebelled, and he was caught and executed. So we really didn't get emancipation until 1838. But I say this to point out that merely passing the Act of Emancipation by the British Parliament in 1834 did not mean that people were free, because the circumstances under which they were forced to work after 1st of August 1834 were really the same as slavery. And in fact, in Guyana, we only recognize the 1st of August 1838 as real emancipation. Now, to come to your question, real emancipation cannot mean a continuation of enslavement. It seems trite, it seems simple, but education is important, because if you are mentally enslaved, if you are so poor in terms of material resources, if you don't have a job, you are still enslaved by the conditions under which you live and work. So mental emancipation, what Bob Marley calls emancipate yourself from mental slavery. Mental enslavement and mental emancipation are things we need to consider. And unless you're educated, unless you can make informed choices about your life, about your religion, about your place of residence, about the form of government under which you want to live and work, you're not really free. So I feel that the important thing in Guyana today, facing the whole population, not just the Africans, but the entire population, is to get the quality education that can allow the population to make informed choices. And I think this is a major failing, because our education system has failed many of our young people.
So it's fair to say we're still somewhat enslaved, eh?
I would say yes. We are still enslaved, because many people have not been able to liberate themselves from mental slavery and from poverty.
All right. Before we come to how we're going to try to get them to liberate themselves, and this may be coming back to the way you kind of responded to the first question. Can you say, based on your research, of course, because we like to call you a historian, can you say exactly what it was like regarding education before emancipation?
Well, I could safely say that education was practically zero, because education became a major battlefield of emancipation, because there was only one mission, what is now the Congregational Church. It used to be called the London Missionary Society, LMS, which came here under a pastor called Hermanus Post. Well, really facilitated by Hermanus Post. It wasn't called Hermanus Post. That was the planter called Hermanus Post. But it was the London Missionary Society which attempted to evangelize, not educate, evangelize the Africans. And because of that, the missions, or the mission particularly, I think most famous in Guyanese history, is a man called John Smith. The missions were ostracized, they were opposed by the planters, because he was preaching the word of God. He was preaching the gospel of Christ. which spoke about humanity, which spoke about, coming to save all people, regardless of their color, whether they were Jew or Gentile. And this message was regarded as disruptive, and the planters were opposed to any form of education. They were opposed to any form of evangelization of the Africans. So I would say, in answer to your question, that education was practically zero. However, a few Creoles, a Creole is a person who was born in Guyana, whereas the Bossas or there were some Africans who were brought in who were fresh. But some people who had been living here before had learned English or Dutch and had actually been Christianized, and one such person was Kwamina. And in fact, the Christians were blamed for the 1823 revolt, particularly on the East Coast, Demerara. Kwamina himself was a deacon. Of course, he's not a priest, he's just a deacon. He was a lay, he could read lessons and so on, but he couldn't, he was not a pastor. And a few of the people who understood, they said, well, look, if God wants us to be free, why are these planters keeping us as slaves? So people perceive Christianity as being the opposite of the enslavement, and they wanted Christianity. But that was the only form of education they have. They weren't sent to schools, and they weren't allowed to read and write. And it was from reading of the Word, teaching of the Word of God, teaching of the Bible, that some Africans became conscious of a world outside of the plantation, outside of slavery. Of course, some of them who came from Africa knew that they lived in free societies before, but it is accepted that one of the triggers for the 1823 revolt on the East Coast was the Christianization of the Africans. And by that time, a small number of them had started to become literate in English. So education was regarded as disruptive, and it was not until after emancipation that we had real schools.
Even though we have real schools now, do you believe that what would have happened in that time? I mean, even though some of us would not have been born as yet, of course, from research that we did and from what our parents would have taught us, do you believe that psychologically we still remember those things, in the sense of it somehow holds some of us back?
Well, education is supposed to be a liberating experience. And it could be that people who are uneducated could be unexposed or unfamiliar with some of the choices that are available to them. But we mustn't take education in a sense that is too academic or too literal, because in 1838, many of the enslaved Africans who now became free were quite intelligent. They knew that, hey, this plantation was a prison. They had to get away from the plantation because the plantation prevented them from marrying, prevented them from having families, prevented them from making choices, prevented them from becoming Christian, prevented them from getting education. So some of them were anxious. They had to continue working, and most Africans continued to work on the plantations. Indians and Portuguese were brought because they felt the Africans would walk off in this great exodus. They didn't really walk off. And it took a long time for immigration to catch on. But in terms of the experience, many Africans resisted the provocation from the planters directly after emancipation in 1830. The planters cut down their planting trees and dug up their provisions and so on, to force the free Africans to continue to work on the plantations for wages. And the Africans resisted this, and they started to mind their own chickens and sell those chickens and provisions to one another. They got money, and they used that money to buy villages. Obviously, in such a short period of time, it had to be a tremendous effort. And of course, sometimes 80 or more people pooled their savings to buy those villages. So they had an intelligence, but it did not come from books. It did not come from book learning. It did not come from going to school. They knew they wanted to be free. They knew they wanted to worship God. They knew that they wanted to keep their families together. They knew they had to work. They had to cut farms. And they had a good idea what they wanted to do without going to school. So I don't want to confuse education and intelligence, because sometimes, we can have people who have a lot of degrees and doctorates, and they're quite, foolish in behavior.
I guess that's what some of us call common sense, or in the ordinary term, street smarts. If we can come to modern day, you basically mentioned already that society is not necessarily free, because people are still uneducated. You still have poor people. My question really is, can society ever at all be free? Because some persons would argue, well, look, in any given year or any given decade, we're going to have poverty, or we're going to have people who are uneducated. Can we really ever be free if we're going to look at it from that angle?
Yes, we can be free, because some forms of poverty are more extreme than others. And I think throughout the world there are certain indices or indicators of poverty. The quality food you eat, your access to clean water and good food, good housing, safety, the level of safety in the community. There are different factors, your health, whether you can get access in the event of disability or disease, you can get access to proper health treatment. These are indicators of your quality of life or of your poverty. So to that extent, I would say yes, it is possible to live a whole country, a whole community out of poverty. But if that community is to be progressive, it needs to be educated. Because, look, for example, you have a situation we had in Burima Waini, in which about 10 children died because of gastroenteritis. It could be that the parents were uninformed, that the water they were consuming was contaminated. It could be that the person providing that water were uneducated or poorly supervised. So I would like to feel, maybe it's a bit idealistic, I would like to feel that in an educated society, we'd have fewer of those disasters. APNU, Partnership for National Unity, brought a motion in the National Assembly concerning the deaths on the rivers. No, those deaths are preventable, because in my presentation to the National Assembly, I pointed out that 100 years ago, measures were being taken to prevent deaths by proper enforcement, proper inspection, proper certification and qualification of the boat operators and so on. So it called for a level of education, it called for a level of enforcement. And 100 years ago, people were able to bring down the deaths. But now we have problems again, because it could be because they're uneducated operators. Sometimes they can't even read the safety instructions because of literacy challenges. So I would feel that if we are to enjoy that good life that the APNU has promised people, if we are to enjoy a higher quality of life, you need an educated population, and definitely you need educated administrators, educated people who are managing the country as a whole. And yes, I think education would lead to better quality of life. I'm convinced about that.
All right. You just mentioned something that you were criticized for a bit recently in the National Assembly, where you talked about the riverine deaths and the fact that, yes, and most of us know that it's a fact, that even some boat operators can't necessarily read instructions. Now, people at that instant when you said it would have criticized you, saying, you should not have said that. What would you say to defend yourself, especially regarding someone who continues to talk about the importance of education in our nation, and especially since we're focusing on education regarding freedom?
Well, as I said, at the time I meant what I said. I don't withdraw my words, I won't recall my words, because people who are placed in charge of the lives of others have to be held to a higher standard. These are not street cleaners. These are persons who actually buy boats, acquire safety equipment, enforce regulations. And transport people from one place to the other, from Parika to Supanam or Parika to Bartika. But in so doing, they have to follow certain instructions. They have to be able to read the law. They have to be able to read safety instructions. They have to make manifests. They have to be able to write down the names of the persons. In the event that there is an accident, they have to be able to write statements. Now, all I'm saying is that people have to be literate to do these things. And I don't think that if the people who criticize me had to go on an airplane and they heard that the pilot was illiterate, he couldn't spell plane, that they'd be very happy. They expect that pilot to be an intelligent, educated person. He has to make calculations, he has to make notes of what is taking place, he has to be able to read and follow instructions. So what's the difference between a pilot flying a plane with 10 passengers, from Ogle to Anna Regina, and a boat operator carrying a boat with 18 passengers from Parika to Supanam? Maybe it's a different level, but both of them have to be able to read and carry out the law, instructions. The pilot has to be safe, the boat operator has to be safe. So I don't think there's any problem with what I have to say, and I would insist that persons who are operating vessels or any vehicles which are responsible for transporting human beings, women and children from place to place, must be literate.
What should a government's role be, or I don't know if I should broaden it and say politicians' role be, when it comes to emancipating a nation, especially regarding education?
Well, as I said, a nation or a people or an individual cannot really be free unless education is easily accessible and is pervasive. Access to education is a right under the Constitution of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. In fact, it says free education. I know we have to pay at university and some secondary schools, but free education is stated in our Constitution to be a right. No, it is the great equalizer, because 175 years ago, we were all illiterate, our parents were illiterate. Many of the Indians who came into this country could not read and write English. Many of the Portuguese and Chinese similarly. In fact, up to 1952, that's about 61 years ago, there was a literacy qualification to vote. People who were not literate in the English language could not vote. It meant that they were being deprived of their civil rights because of a literacy problem. And sometimes, even if they were literate in Portuguese or Hindi or Urdu, they were not allowed to vote. So we are past that stage now. We know that if we are to move ahead in terms of public administration, in terms of good governance, we need to ensure that people can make choices. They can read the Constitution. At the time of election, they can read a manifesto for People's Progressive Party, manifesto for Partnership for National Unity, manifesto, and make choices. Without access to education, people could be victims of vile propaganda. And I think in uneducated, I'm not saying that an educated person will always make the right choice, but at least that person will make an informed choice. And that person will understand that he or she has to live with the consequences of his choice, whatever choice they make. So I would say that education is essential to democracy. It's essential to quality of life. It's essential to everything we do.
The People's National Congress was in government for about 28 years. Would you say that under that administration, enough would have been done to emancipate our people, especially regarding education?
Well, just as an aside, I must point out to you that the People's Progressive Party has also been in government for 28 years. Mm-hmm. It was in government for 7 years between 1957 and 1964, that's 7 years, and 21 years from 1992 to the present time, so 21 plus 7 is 28. Now, our founder leader, the first president, first executive president of this country, the first prime minister of Guyana, felt that education was important to liberation, to full emancipation of our people. He was the first elected minister of the government to be responsible for education in 1953. And when he got into office in 1964, he acquired a plot of land from the Sugar Corporation at that time, and he built the University of Guyana campus at Turkine. It was under the PNC that the Turkine campus was built. Similarly, the Silupati campus was built also in Turkine. That used to be a sugar plantation. Now, he was so committed to education that in 1976, which is the 100th anniversary of a bill that was passed in what is then called the Court of Policy in 1876, he introduced free education from nursery to university. It meant that for the first time in the history of this country, no Guyanese child had to pay fees at nursery, primary, secondary, or university. For different reasons, that had been stopped now. But it was, I would say, a golden age, because many people were able to qualify, and many people who never had a chance at tertiary education or even secondary education were able to get qualifications. In the past, even at the Queen's College, St. Stanislaus College, St. Rose's, St. Joseph, all of these places, you had to pay fees. But fees were abolished in 1976. So I would say that the People's National Congress did the most for education. When they got into government, there were no schools for hinterland children. The rich families, particularly ranchers in Europa, would send their children down to Georgetown to attend secondary school. But the PNC started building schools with dormitories for Amerindian children. Similarly, scholarships, offering scholarships. In fact, Dr. George Norton was one of the earliest recipients of a scholarship. He studied ophthalmology in Cuba. So at all levels, you see that there was a very vigorous approach to education. Now, when the PNC got into office in 1964, education was a mess. In fact, the university was underfunded, and there were not enough secondary schools. And one was able to encourage the construction by self-help of secondary schools. So within the first decade, between 1964 and 1974, there's a massive expansion of educational opportunities, education institutions, schools were built. If you go around the country, you'll see at that time, they were really the best looking secondary schools. The multilateral schools at Anna Regina, Bladen Hall, Bijgeval, New Amsterdam, Wismar, and North Rheinfeld. I think there were half a dozen in all. When you stepped into these multilateral schools, there were so many typewriters for children doing secretarial sciences. There were stoves and other equipment for people doing domestic science. There were gymnasium. They were really beautifully conceived buildings. But I think that the PNC saw education as being a liberating and emancipating experience for Guyana. Unfortunately, towards the end of the 1970s, at that time there was a sort of international crisis caused by the increase in oil prices in the OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and there was a massive debt problem which affected Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, and Guyana. And because of that debt problem, some of our educational institutions were not adequately funded. But the concept that was introduced by Forbes Burnham was one of free education, and it still is embedded in our Constitution. But I would say that it was the PNC government from 1964 to 1992 which did most for transforming the education landscape. There are so many schools now, so many children have access to education. That all started around that time.
Finally, sir, I know you're not the government. What would David Granger do? And focusing, especially since you just mentioned it too, on free education, what would David Granger do to further emancipate society and bring better education to our nation? And how free would it be? Would the education be?
Well, it continues to be my aim to provide free education. I do believe it's the right. Right now in Guyana, we have what I would call education apartheid, that some people who are rich can afford to send their children to pay schools and get a higher quality of education. The teachers are better paid, the facilities are better, and as a result of that, the children achieve better grades, as you can see, at the level of National Grade 6 examinations, which were recently published. Education should be the great equalizer. It means that a person from poor circumstances, poor housing, poor communities, should be able to develop his or her talent, just as a person from a rich society. Otherwise, we'll be perpetuating a situation of inequality, in which the rich get richer because they are better educated, they get better jobs, and the poor remain poor, what I call hereditary poverty, because the parents can't buy the books, the parents can't pay exam fees, the parents can't even buy lunch for them, the parents can't even provide transport for them to get to school. So I'm looking at creating an education system which promotes equality in Guyana. And it's not just giving children books, because in the People's National Congress Reform, we've introduced something called the BEST, the Burnham Education Scholarship Trust. It is just a start. But we need to see better schools with proper laboratories, proper facilities, proper furniture, comfort. We need to have better paid teachers, and I promise the teachers that they'll be the best paid public servants. I've been criticized for that, I've been criticized for a lot of things, but let the country think about it. If the teachers are the best paid public servants in the country, we get a higher quality of education. So I have a holistic approach to education. Better schools, better staffing, better resources, better transport, better school meals, so that our children become the best in the Caribbean. I do believe that we could be, because in times gone by, not so long ago, children coming out of Guyana did very well wherever they went. People who just had a secondary school education would go to American University, and the lecturers would say, where did you do your first degree? You know, because the quality of the language, the ideas, the performance generally was so high quality. So I aim at that quality again, and I think we need to have a holistic view. I don't want to see Amerindian children fetching logs. I don't want to see 16,000 children writing National Grade 6, and most of them can't get 50%. I want to see an education nation all over again. We were there before, and we'll get there again.
Thank you very much, sir. Leader of the People's National Congress Reform and leader of the opposition, Mr. David Granger. This has been another program of the Public Interest, and we were discussing what I call a continuation of last week's program. Today we focused on education regarding emancipation. Until next time, I am Malaika Ramsey. Thanks for watching.